In this video, we're taking a chilling journey into the dark history of Oklahoma's death row, specifically the women who were executed by the state. These are not just names on a list. These were real women with real stories, some twisted, some tragic, all ending in the most final of sentences, death. We'll uncover their crimes, what they ate for their last meal, and the haunting final words they left behind. Before we uncover these haunting stories, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Join our true crime community and never miss a tale that will leave you speechless. Hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when a new case drops. Wanda Jean Allen. Wanda Jean wasn't a serial killer. She wasn't a gang leader, but she was the first black woman executed in the United States in the modern era. And her story, marked by poverty, trauma, and questions about her mental capacity, still lingers as a stark reminder of how complicated the death penalty can truly be. Born in 1959 in Oklahoma City, Wanda Jean grew up in deep poverty. Her family lived in one of the city's most impoverished neighborhoods, and she faced constant instability during her childhood. Her mother was largely absent due to mental illness and addiction. Wanda and her siblings were left to fend for themselves from a very young age. At just 12 years old, Wanda suffered a traumatic head injury when she was hit by a truck. The damage wasn't minor. It left her with permanent brain impairment. Later evaluations suggested her IQ was in the mid-60s, a level considered to be intellectually disabled. She had difficulties understanding consequences, managing emotions, and navigating basic life challenges, but none of this was ever properly diagnosed or treated. By her teens, Wanda had already found herself in and out of trouble, and in 1981, she was convicted of manslaughter for the shooting death of a former girlfriend, Dedra Pettis. That case was ruled as self-defense during a domestic argument, and she served just a few years before being released. 7 years later, in 1988, Wanda was in another volatile relationship, this time with Gloria Leathers, a woman who had also served time in prison. The two had a rocky, sometimes violent relationship. On one particular day in December, the two women got into an explosive argument that escalated quickly. Gloria called the police for help, and officers escorted both women to the police station to mediate. But outside the station, as Gloria was walking away with her mother, Wanda pulled a gun and shot her in the abdomen, killing her in broad daylight, right in front of witnesses. Wanda was arrested on the spot. The case seemed open and shut. She was charged with first-degree murder, and the prosecution pushed hard for the death penalty, arguing she was a repeat offender, dangerous and beyond rehabilitation. But behind the scenes, there were serious cracks in the process. Wanda's defense team never introduced any evidence of her intellectual disability, her brain damage, or the trauma she had suffered as a child. No psychologists testified. No experts were called. In fact, the jury never heard that Wanda was likely mentally impaired and possibly unable to fully understand the consequences of her actions. Had they known, it's possible her sentence would have been different. Years later, experts would say Wanda should never have even been eligible for the death penalty under evolving standards of decency and legal protections for those with intellectual disabilities. By the time these concerns came to light, it was too late. The courts rejected appeals. The governor denied clemency, and on January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was scheduled for execution. In her final hours, Wanda remained calm, almost eerily so. She spent time with her spiritual advisor, prayed, and prepared herself for what was coming. She did not lash out. She did not cry. Many described her as resigned. Her last meal was heartbreakingly simple: 2 pieces of fried chicken, 2 slices of white bread, a packet of ketchup, and a Diet Pepsi. Nothing fancy, no dessert, no requests for excess, just the basics. When the time came, she was led into the execution chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. As the straps were fastened across her arms and chest, she looked peaceful. And then came her final words, a quiet but powerful prayer. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Those in the witness room described the moment as deeply unsettling. A woman condemned by the state, offering forgiveness to the very people taking her life. Some witnesses were visibly shaken. Others sat in stunned silence. At 9:21 p.m., the lethal injection was administered. By 9:25, Wanda Jean Allen was pronounced dead. She was 41 years old. Marilyn Plants. This story unfolds in Midwest City, Oklahoma, in the summer of 1988. On the surface, Marilyn Plants appeared to be a typical suburban wife and mother. She was 25 years old, married to James Plants, and they had 2 young children together. James worked long hours to provide for the family, and neighbors described him as a quiet, hard-working man who doted on his wife and kids. But behind closed doors, things were far from perfect. What started as marital dissatisfaction soon spiraled into something far darker. Marilyn began an affair with a 19-year-old named William McKimble, a teenager she met through mutual acquaintances. Their relationship was intense and dangerous. Fueled by a mix of passion, desperation, and greed, the two began to plot something unthinkable. Marilyn wanted out of the marriage, but not through divorce. She wanted James dead. The motive? A $300,000 life insurance policy that James had recently taken out, naming Marilyn as the sole beneficiary. And she didn't intend to do it alone. Together with McKimble and his friend Dutry Langston, the plan was set. Stage a fake robbery at the Plants' home and kill James in the process. Marilyn's job was to get him home and keep things normal. The rest, she left in their hands. On August 26, 1988, Marilyn and James returned home after an evening out. Their 2 young children were asleep in the house. James had no idea that 2 teens were waiting inside with baseball bats and gasoline, ready to carry out a staged invasion. As James walked through the door, he was ambushed and beaten brutally with a baseball bat. He tried to fight back, but the attack was overwhelming. With James unconscious, the attackers placed him in his pickup truck, drove to a secluded area, poured gasoline over him, and set him on fire while he was still alive. The crime was brutal, personal, and calculated. Marilyn, meanwhile, played the role of distraught wife. She called police to report a robbery. She cried. She tried to maintain the story, but within days, the truth began to unravel. Investigators quickly uncovered inconsistencies. Phone records, witness accounts, and confessions led to the arrest of all 3 involved. McKimble and Langston confessed, implicating Marilyn as the mastermind behind the entire plan. She was arrested, charged with first-degree murder, and the state of Oklahoma began preparing for trial. During the trial, prosecutors painted Marilyn as cold, manipulative, and remorseless. They argued that she didn't just want her husband dead, she orchestrated the entire thing from beginning to end. The defense tried to portray her as emotionally unstable and heavily influenced by the young men she surrounded herself with. But the jury didn't buy it. In 1990, Marilyn Plants was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Years passed. Her 2 accomplices were also sentenced, one to life, the other to death, though his sentence was later commuted. But Marilyn remained on death row for more than a decade, appealing her sentence while the clock ticked down. On May 1, 2001, the end finally came. After exhausting all appeals, Marilyn Plants was scheduled to die by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She had spent 11 years on death row, largely in solitude, cut off from the world that once knew her as a mother, a wife, a neighbor. In her final hours, she met with spiritual advisors and exchanged emotional letters with her children, now grown and forever altered by the events of their childhood. Her last meal. Marilyn's last meal reflected comfort and indulgence, perhaps a final nod to normalcy before the state carried out its sentence. She requested a barbecue beef sandwich, French fries, a salad, 2 slices of chocolate cake, and a Coca-Cola. There were no unusual requests, no last-minute changes, just one last meal before the silence. At 9 p.m., Marilyn was brought into the execution chamber. Witnesses described her demeanor as composed, though clearly emotional. She wore glasses, her hair was tied back neatly. As she was strapped to the gurney and the IV lines were inserted, she turned her head to the glass separating her from the witness area. There, behind the glass, were members of James Plants' family, and, most heartbreakingly, her own children, now adults, watching their mother's final moments. With her voice trembling, she spoke, "I want to tell my children I love them. I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen." Tears welled in her eyes. Her voice cracked mid-sentence. The room fell into heavy silence as the lethal chemicals began to flow. Within minutes, Marilyn Plant slipped into unconsciousness. By 9:11 p.m., she was pronounced dead. She was 40 years old. Her story takes us back over a century, to a time when executions were public spectacles and newspapers served as both judge and jury. This is the case of Clarissa Hardy, one of the earliest women ever executed in the state of Oklahoma. While much of her story has been swallowed by time, what remains is chilling enough to echo across generations. The year was likely around 1915, in the early years of Oklahoma statehood. At that time, the criminal justice system operated under very different rules, and public opinion carried a heavy influence over the outcome of trials. Clarissa Hardy was a quiet, middle-aged woman who lived with her husband on the outskirts of a small Oklahoma town. From the outside, their life looked simple, rural, uneventful. But beneath the surface, something darker was brewing. When Mr. Hardy fell ill suddenly and died in agony, neighbors became suspicious. His symptoms were violent: seizures, convulsions, and foaming at the mouth. It didn't look like a natural death. Authorities launched an investigation, and within days, strychnine poisoning was confirmed. A common pesticide at the time, strychnine was also a known method of murder, particularly in cases where subtlety was key. The poison causes a slow, excruciating death, attacking the nervous system while the victim remains conscious. All eyes quickly turned to Clarissa. The newspapers pounced on the story. Headlines labeled her the cold widow, painting her as a woman without remorse, without tears. Her motives, while never fully clear, were speculated to include greed, revenge, and perhaps a desire for freedom from a loveless marriage. It didn't help that Clarissa never appeared emotionally distraught in court. She sat stiff, silent, and composed, a demeanor the press described as unnaturally calm. Prosecutors claimed she had purchased the poison under the pretense of pest control and had carefully laced her husband's food with it. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning enough. In a matter of weeks, the trial ended with a conviction. Clarissa Hardy was sentenced to death by hanging, the standard method of execution at the time. Because this case predates modern record-keeping, many details surrounding her final day are lost to history. We don't know what she ate for her last meal, if she had any visitors, or whether she received any final blessings. All that remains are fragments: court transcripts, yellowed newspaper clippings, and second-hand accounts from guards and reporters. But one moment has stood the test of time. As the noose was placed around her neck, and the executioner prepared to release the trapdoor, Clarissa was asked if she had any final words. She paused, then quietly whispered, "I did what I had to." Those 5 words still echo today, haunting in their ambiguity. Was it a confession, a defense, or something else entirely? No one knows. And she took the full meaning of that sentence to her grave. By noon, her body was cut down. The execution was reported in the next day's paper with a single cold headline: "Justice served." Velma Davis. In the backdrop of poverty and survival, we find the haunting case of Velma Davis, one of the few women ever hanged in the state of Oklahoma. Her name may not be widely known, but the way she died and the silence she kept have cemented her as one of the most enigmatic figures in Oklahoma's death penalty history. The year was somewhere in the early 1930s, and Oklahoma, like much of the country, was reeling from economic collapse. Unemployment was sky high, banks had failed, families were hungry, and in that chaos, crime surged, especially small-town robberies and store holdups. Velma Davis, a young woman in her early 20s, had fallen in with the wrong crowd. She was romantically involved with a man known to local law enforcement as a small-time criminal. Together, along with another accomplice, they planned what was supposed to be a simple robbery of a local general store. But it didn't go as planned. During the robbery, the shopkeeper fought back and was shot and killed in the scuffle. Whether Velma pulled the trigger or simply stood by is still debated. But under felony murder laws, her presence and participation were enough to make her just as guilty in the eyes of the court. She was arrested, tried alongside her male co-defendants, and sentenced to death by hanging, a rare punishment for a woman at the time. Many believed the men would face execution while Velma might receive leniency, but the court made no exception. Despite her defense arguing that she had no prior criminal record and that her involvement was minor, the jury rendered its verdict: guilty, no mercy. On the morning of her execution, Velma was led from her holding cell at the state prison in McAlester. Unlike her co-defendants, her case was not widely covered in the national press. At the time, female executions were almost taboo, rarely discussed, and even more rarely witnessed. There is no record of her last meal, only that she was offered one. She reportedly declined to speak with clergy, made no final requests, and spent her last hours in quiet solitude. She refused the presence of family or the press. Witnesses described her demeanor as resigned, neither defiant nor emotional. When asked if she had any final words before the executioner pulled the lever, Velma responded simply, "I have nothing to say." And with that, the trapdoor opened. Her body hung silently as the crowd of officials and guards looked on. No crying, no shouting, just silence and the creak of the rope. That silence has become a defining part of her legacy. Velma Davis didn't beg, she didn't explain, she didn't confess, she simply went. And while her male co-defendants were later buried in marked graves, Velma's final resting place remains unconfirmed. No public record tells where she was laid to rest. It's as if, after her execution, the world quietly closed the chapter on her story. But her silence on the gallows, that brief moment where she chose to say nothing, left an eerie mark in Oklahoma's execution history. A mark that still lingers, barely remembered, but never fully erased. Not every story in this video ends with an execution. Some are still waiting for their final chapter to be written. One such case is that of Brenda Andrew, who as of today remains on death row in Oklahoma, the only woman currently awaiting execution in the state. Her story is one of manipulation, betrayal, and cold calculation, wrapped in a carefully constructed image of suburban normalcy. Brenda and her husband, Rob Andrew, lived in a quiet Oklahoma City neighborhood with their 2 young children. From the outside, they appeared to be the model family. Rob was a respected advertising executive. Brenda stayed home, took care of the kids, and helped run the household. But behind the facade, things were falling apart. Brenda was unfaithful, and not just casually. She was involved in an intense affair with James Pavat, a former church deacon and insurance salesman. The two shared more than just passion, they shared a plan. The motive? Money. Specifically, Rob's $800,000 life insurance policy, which Pavat had helped write. And disturbingly, Brenda was listed as the beneficiary. It wasn't long before suspicions arose, especially when Brenda's behavior became increasingly erratic. She told friends that Rob was abusive, claims that were never substantiated. And while she tried to paint herself as the victim, evidence would later suggest she was orchestrating a deadly scheme. On November 20th, 2001, Rob stopped by Brenda's house to pick up the kids for Thanksgiving break. He had been living separately after their relationship had deteriorated. Brenda had agreed to a custody handoff, but what Rob didn't know was that it was all a setup. As Rob entered the garage, he was ambushed and shot multiple times, once in the neck and again in the torso. The shooter, James Pavat. Brenda was also grazed in the arm, which investigators would later say was staged to make the attack look like a robbery gone wrong. But the crime scene told a different story. Nothing was stolen, and the entire incident appeared too clean, too convenient. It didn't take long before detectives started looking closer at Brenda, and what they found unraveled everything. Just 2 days after the murder, Brenda and Pavat fled to Mexico, taking her children with them. The flight was seen as an admission of guilt, and the FBI issued a warrant. The pair were later captured and extradited back to the U.S., where they stood trial for Rob's murder. At trial, prosecutors laid out a damning case. Brenda and Pavat, they argued, planned the murder for months, with Brenda luring Rob to his death and Pavat pulling the trigger. The life insurance policy, the staged attack, the immediate flight to Mexico, it all pointed to premeditation and cold intent. Brenda's defense tried to paint her as a woman caught in the web of a manipulative man, but the jury didn't buy it. In 2004, Brenda Andrew was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She became the only woman on Oklahoma's death row, a position she still holds to this day. Unlike the previous stories in this video, Brenda has not been executed. Her case remains in legal limbo, tied up in a series of appeals and post-conviction reviews. She continues to maintain her innocence, and her legal team has argued procedural errors and issues with how the jury was instructed during her trial. But until a final decision is made, Brenda Andrew remains in a high-security facility, awaiting a fate that may or may not ever come. While her story doesn't end with a final meal or last words, yet it serves as a powerful reminder that not all death row cases end quickly or cleanly. Some drag on for decades, surrounded by layers of legal complexity and moral debate. While executions of women are rare, they carry a unique weight in the world of criminal justice. These stories challenge our perceptions of justice, punishment, and mercy. From last meals to final words, they remind us that behind every execution is a life full of choices, trauma, and consequence. If these stories gripped you, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime content that goes deeper than headlines. Like this video if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, and drop a comment below. Which of these executions surprised you the most? Thank you for watching. We'll be back soon with more true crime investigations, real last words, and the chilling details most stories leave out.